Hi there, Danielle Smith back again. And, I'm so interested in the fact that I've got assigned another session that is likely to give me anxiety based on the last career that I had in the mainstream media. I found it so fascinating to watch the conversation with Christine Van Gyn from the Canadian Constitution Foundation, Bruce Pardy, and Matt Buffton. I must tell you, I take Bruce Pardy's warnings very, very seriously. And I found it interesting the way the conversation was going on. I was thinking, nope, that would never be a conversation you could have on mainstream media these days without a broadcast standard council complaint and very likely someone written up because of it. So I want to put this into perspective because there seems to be some doubt on behalf of those in the conservative movement and the liberty movement that cancel culture is real. And maybe our guest here is going to disabuse you of that notion. Douglas Murray is a best-selling author and journalist based in Britain. His books include the Sunday Times #1 bestseller, The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, and Islam, and The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race, and Identity, which is what we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about here today. He has been the associate editor at The Spectator magazine since 2012 and has written regularly there, as well as for other publications, including the Wall Street Journal, The Times, The Sunday Times, The Sun, The Mail, on Sunday, and the National Review. He's a regular guest on BBC and other news channels, and he's also spoken at numerous universities, parliaments, the O2 Arena, and the White House. And he joins us now to talk about whether there is going to be civility or a return to civility in the age of cancel culture. Douglas, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you and all of your audience.
So let's talk about cancel culture, because I know that there's some resistance to using that term and even some disbelief that it actually is real. Tell us your take on it. Is cancel culture something we should be concerned about?
I think so. I think that anyone with any public profile should be concerned about it. And increasingly, people with no public profile ought to be concerned about it. It's a new term for something that's fairly familiar, an attempt to basically unperson somebody for a crime of thought, something that's non-criminal, but it is deemed to be bad enough that you must be cast out from what remains of polite society. What has made this new in the last decade, I would say, is, of course, social media, which means that people can jump onto a person they didn't know existed until a few minutes ago, believe they've got a total estimation of that person's life and thought, can assume they know the interior thoughts of that person better than the person themselves, can harvest a few words here or there, and from that completely transform a person's life and a reading of that person's life. It's completely uncharitable, and it has the opportunity to completely destroy somebody. One example that I think was very resonant at the beginning of this phenomenon in 2015, very distinguished scientist, Professor Tim Hunt, a professor at University College London, among other places, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, very distinguished in his field, gives a talk at a conference in South Korea, makes a passing, not very good, but he's a scientist, joke about men and women in the lab. One person in the audience decides to say on Twitter that this was a misogynistic joke. By the time Professor Hunt's plane has landed in London 24 hours later, he's been stripped of every single position he holds. And so when people say, oh, well, are you sure you're not making it up? Are you sure? No, these are real cases. They can be exaggerated. Increasingly, there are people who sort of want to be cancelled and want the sort of prestige that they think comes with it. So there's definitely overstatement about the phenomenon from some people. But this is something that can come to people who are public and people who are completely unknown, whose lives can be picked up, spun around, and dispensed with by effectively the new mob.
When we were just talking off the air about Tim Hunt, I don't remember that. I was just getting into the media in 2015. It does strike me that in the last year, we have seen far more examples of it. And I want to run a few of these by you, because the thing I began to find really alarming is that it's not just against conservatives. So I look at James Bennett from the New York Times getting deplatformed for publishing a column by a US Senator, Tom Cotton. You'd never have been deplatformed for something like that 20 years ago. I look at J.K. Rowling, beloved children's author, getting deplatformed for her comments on transgenderism. Jessica Mulroney probably has the most famous Black friend on the planet, and she's perceived to have too much white privilege and using her power. These are people I would think of more of being on the left or center left. And so it seems like it's sort of equal opportunity cancellation now. Do you have some comments on those ones?
It actually isn't equal opportunity cancellation. Conservatives are still allowed to exist so long as we're in a silo, so long as we're never allowed to use the left's toys, even the centre's toys. So the moment that any conservative comes close to the media or increasingly parts of the cultural world that are deemed to be part of the left, they are treated with the full force of the mob. What is striking, and the cases you just gave examples of it, is that what is happening is increasingly figures who we would have just called liberals. I know that liberals is a very shape-shifting term in all of our countries, but in the classical sense, liberals, people who believed in tolerance, toleration, and much more, are the people who are coming in for this. So people who are not, right-wingers, not conservative, people, as you say, like J.K. Rowling, who just hold on to principles which were always deemed to be of the left. But in the shifting arena we're now all in, there are certain issues which, if you touch them, effectively throw you right onto the completely appalling, unmentionable conservative side. And those are the ones, briefly, that I mention in each chapter in The Madness of Crowds, which are you can see by now there are specific issues which will get you into this trouble. The tripwires of our time, as I say, they're everything to do with sex, everything to do with gender, everything to do with sexuality, everything to do with race. The Jessica Mulroney example you give is particularly pertinent because this is not actually somebody being criticized for what they've said, somebody being criticized for what they haven't said, for their silence. And here we get into proper, soft totalitarian territory, where in democracies where we're meant to have the freedom to speak and to exchange ideas, the moment you not only get destroyed for voicing your ideas, but for not saying the thing that you are demanded to say that day, not jumping to the height you're expected to jump, through the hoop you're expected to jump through, that is an incredibly unpleasant and ugly turn of this. And so, yes, these phenomena are real. And I think, apart from anything else, increasingly, everybody in business in the developed world knows this as well. Increasingly, businesses, corporations have to play by these rules. We saw an example recently where a senior figure at KPMG made a reference in passing to the fact that he thought unconscious bias training was a bit of a crock. I think he was too kind about unconscious bias training. But anyway, he just mentioned this to his colleagues. Bang, he's out of a job within 24 hours. So we're not just talking about, the odd scientist here, the odd celebrity influencer here. We're talking about the fact that increasingly in all realms of life, including the business world, which so many people from the outside mistakenly think to be conservative, even in the business world, you have people effectively having to silence themselves or say only the approved things in order to continue working.
So here's, I guess, the thing someone would say is looking at your career, you say very provocative things, have written 2 very provocative books, and you're still associate editor for The Spectator. So that is given as evidence that cancel culture can't be all that bad.
Well, there are several things about that. I don't particularly like to talk about myself because I'm British. But my own experience is slightly unusual in that I don't care. Now, this is a very important factor. First of all, I don't care about the critics, as it were. And secondly, and I say this with a slight trepidation, but I think it's honest, they don't seem to be able to get me. And the reason why is because I do not have weak and cowardly bosses above me. This is very, very important because the thing that's made the cancel culture problem so rife is the fact that what is attempted every time to really cancel something, you have to go to the level above them. You have to go to their editor in media terms. That's the case with the New York Times. So quite a number of employees now have had to leave the Times for completely fallacious, erroneous reasons, but it's because the heads of the New York Times are cowardly and very easily intimidated weaklings, in my view. They don't have the confidence even to believe in the free media. It's a very sad situation. But that's why those employees are vulnerable. The problem with KPMG is the people above that person are vulnerable. When a supermarket worker in the UK posted a Billy Connolly video that mentioned Islam, and was fired from his position for sharing this video on his own Facebook page, the Asda supermarket bosses fired him. Why? Because they were cowardly. So whether it's a supermarket worker or a writer or editor at the New York Times, doesn't matter. If you have people above you who can effectively sit on you from this pressure, then that's where you're vulnerable. I'm really answerable to no one. In a way, I'm answerable to my readers, who I hope to inform and entertain and much more. But I don't have a thing above me that is wobbly and weak to that extent.
Can you sort of address one other aspect of that, though? Because I think what has happened now with media concentration, or maybe another way of looking at it, is the issue on the advertising side, that the media has become so dependent on a concentration of advertisers that if one of those advertisers gets wobbly, then that can influence the editors of the newspaper. And I think that that's what I've observed, is that if you can do a Twitter campaign that targets that particular company, that particular company is then turning around and saying, "Ooh, we're going to pull our advertising." And that's when bosses don't stand by their people.
But again, this is a very fine explanation of the problem, Danielle, but it's not a justification, of course. And there can be no justification for media bosses or anyone else altering what they say because of pressure from advertisers. And you and I are old enough to know that in the past, this was a career ender for a boss. If a major newspaper came under pressure from one of its advertisers to change its editorial line and changed the editorial line, that editor would not be very long for the newsroom. So what is needed, among other things, is a change in attitude. By the way, you mentioned The Spectator earlier. As you said, I'm associate editor. We had a very interesting example of this at The Spectator magazine. We're one of the best-selling magazines in the UK, read very widely, and we run quite a very wide range of opinion. One of the things we've run quite a lot about in recent years, like everyone who's interested in the culture, is things to do with trans. Now, some of that writing is critical of trans ideology, and much of that has been written by female writers of the left, by the way, who cannot get published in left-wing journals and organs such as they are these days. What was interesting about a year ago was that there was a supermarket in the UK called The Co-op, who were lobbied by one trans activist who said, "You advertised in The Spectator last week, and that magazine has run anti-trans comment, and you should apologize or I will never buy from your supermarkets again." And what was interesting was that the Co-op immediately said, "We will not do it again." Now, why do I mention this story? This is the sort of thing that can happen every day. What's interesting about the story was our response as a magazine. Our chairman turned around and said, "You know what? You're banned. We don't want your advertisement. How dare you try to bully the free press in this way? We will not run anything from you." And there was a counter campaign, and I and others pointed out, this is a supermarket that's had terrible corruption problems at its sister bank in recent years. It's got terrible customer service. It's got all sorts of things that are shoddy. This was the sort of thing you do to cover up real life failings. So in other words, this supermarket started to realize there was a reputational risk to what they were doing, where they thought there had been only a reputational gain. And the reason I tell that story is to remind people that it's not the case that we all have to be sitting ducks, being plucked off by obscure, vengeful figures for the rest of time. It is possible for the adults to stand up for themselves.
Do you think that Britain maybe has a different culture then than the US or Canada? Because I think the conversation earlier led to a disagreement where they said, "Okay, well, we'll come back in 10 years' time and see who's right." Do you see that there's a trend moving one way or the other?
Well, it's certainly a trend. I mean, one of the things that's very obvious but is little mentioned in our era is that we all in our countries, I of course haven't been to Canada in the last year or more, but my sense is, it's always been when I've been there, that the situation is very similar to that in the UK and the US, and that our countries are similar, as with Australia, among other reasons, is that we all get the cultural export of America for good and ill. And the cancel culture phenomenon is basically an American culture war spillage. It doesn't really fit into other countries. It fits enough for vengeful people in search of purpose to adopt it and run with it, definitely. And again, I mean, you can tell this from the fact that the things that are picked up to run with are always and everywhere the same. All this obsession with gender and sexuality, this boring, non-scientific, non-specific, ill-lettered attempt to rewrite chromosomes and the history of our species in this new way. Everything to do with race, this obsession with race as the primary understanding of everything. This is an American culture war. It just doesn't apply very well elsewhere to the extent that it applies at all. I mean, we had, George Floyd protests in the UK, protesting against police, armed police brutality against ethnic minorities. And we don't have that problem in the UK. We just don't have it. That's not complacency. It's just wrong. We don't even have armed police in the UK. So there's something bizarre in all of our countries that we've all imbibed specific things in the American culture wars. And I think that our cultures should be stronger than that. The French, for instance, who I much admire in all sorts of ways. I know that traditionally British people are meant to be in some kind of rivalry with the French. I don't feel it. But the French have experienced the same thing I've just described in recent years and have been much more robust. When the statue toppling began last summer, or at least reached a peak last summer in America and for a moment in the UK, the French President Emmanuel Macron said, no, we are not cancelling France's past. Nothing will come down. We will bring down no monuments and no statues. And when the American version of French theory that has come back at France, as it has everywhere else, from the American academies into this critical race theory, started to rush into the French Academy recently, French professors stood up and said, no, we will not take this. This is against our entire culture. It is not legitimate. They resisted it. So my question always to every other country is, if the French can signal out what is for them and what is not, then why can't others? Why can't Canadians? Why can't the British? Why are other people so weak in the face of this strange tsunami from the US?
Well, I wonder, is Twitter the tie that binds? Because it does seem to me that is the worst thing that can happen. If you trend on Twitter, it's because you've either posted some funny cat video that's gone viral, or it's because you're getting trashed. And I don't even know if there's any value in trying to engage on the platform anymore. But I wonder, is Twitter sort of an English language phenomenon? And that's part of the reason why it's the tie that binds, that so much of the American culture spills over. Is that the root of our problems?
It's certainly, I mean, social media has what I describe as a deranging effect on every debate. There's an obvious reason for that, which is that the nature of the platform and this is a virtue of it in a way, but allows the most obscure voice to rise up momentarily above the babble and go down. And what that means, among other things, that it has massively accentuated one of the most interesting things in our day, which is the movement of our cultures from cultures that admire heroism and bravery into cultures that basically envy suffering and victimhood. We've created in our own lifetimes this very strange inversion where, as a result, people want to be seen as victims. So that on absolutely any day, millions of people log on to social media, and a very large number go into the day in order to be acclaimed as a victim on the platforms. And that means that people exaggerate, they lose perspective, and much more. And most people are decent and don't want to turn around to somebody who claims victimhood and say even, oh yeah, prove it. Let alone, are you sure that we should care about this? And these are, in any normal discussion, perfectly reasonable answers. But people get put onto the back foot by this. Increasingly, I've said this when I was writing about migration in The Strange Death of Europe. Increasingly, you see the effects of this in significant government policy, where a policy decision is made, for instance, close the border, something that has, of course, happened everywhere in the last year, but used to be unthinkable. If you said close the border, then the next thing would happen was somebody would post video of somebody being turned away at a border, and that would go viral, and it's very unpleasant. And so policy could be made like that. We saw in 2015 the German chancellor actually saying, we can't close the border because we can't have the footage of border guards repelling people. Well, that means that it's not then in the hands of government, doesn't it? It means that it's effectively in the hands of what will be posted on social media and make a government vulnerable. And I think that all of us have been very slow to appreciate this is a major change, not only in the nature of communication technology, but a major change in power, which is, after all, one of the obsessions of the radical left, but an amazing change in power that we have not yet grappled with in our day.
Well, I want to ask you about the 4 chapter headings, because I guess I am old enough now. I'm 50, so I'm a Gen Xer, and I'm old enough to remember when there were legitimate grievances in each of these areas. And there was a lot of work that everyone had to do to get to a level of equality. And so that's why I'm kind of wondering what went wrong, and is there still unfinished business? So one of your chapters is gay, and just look at the US. I don't know when they finally allowed for the civil unions between same-sex couples, but it was I think within the last 10 years. We're a little bit further ahead than that, but there were legitimate issues there. So how did that issue go from being one that we could all stand and say, yes, we have to resolve this, to now there's a fear that perhaps you could misspeak and then end up being on the other end of a cancellation?
Well, I mean, I started the Man to the Crowds with gay because it's the one sort of crampon on this awful, ugly wall of social justice that I can claim to hold. And I say, look, if I'm willing to explore this honesty on this, and I sort of say to the reader, then trust me when I'm doing, relations between the sexes, race, and much more, that I'm not trying to pull a fast one on any of those either. But what was interesting to me in each of these categories, as I say in the book, is that all of them start with a reasonable claim. We could do that on any of the ones. It has not been the case historically that women had all of the opportunities that they have today. And there are large parts of the world where women do not have the opportunities which they ought to have today. So none of this is a phantom, but what has happened in recent decades in the West, this is again, one has to be specific, these are in our countries, what has happened has been that there's been massive progress in issues to do with rights, and people have accumulated more and more rights. And it was all done in the name of equality. But one of the things I realized in recent years was that two things in particular happen. The first is you have legacy campaigning organizations that do not know that they should go home, that the barricades are no longer the place to be. So you have gay rights organizations in recent years who need more campaigns, and they campaign and double down on trans, for instance. Now, you might be in favor of trans rights. You may be in favor of everything that is asked for in that. But that is clearly a different issue than the gay one. And nevertheless, by the point of victory in gay rights, these organizations were very, very rich, very powerful, and they needed something to do. It's the same with most racial equality groups. It's not to say that everything is still perfect or has become perfect, but they campaign now. I was watching CNN a couple of nights ago, and to watch CNN today, you would honestly believe that we lived at a time where America was ruled by the Ku Klux Klan. Their timing is completely out, and it's because they're campaigning, money-raising organizations that if they didn't have these great ogres and specters of the past to wave before people, they would be recognized for being as basically defunct as they are. But a second thing that has happened is more important in a way, because that's the sort of procedural explanation. The deeper and more important explanation is it seems that there is a difficulty in getting to equality and stopping at equality. We have seen in recent years something which I identify in the Man to the Crowds as being, from people who think that the best way to get to equality is to go to overcorrection for a time in the hope that the pendulum will swing back. This was the case in third and fourth wave feminism. It was a little bit there in second wave feminism, but effectively, when feminism starts and it's a demand for equality between the sexes, there is always an offshoot. And in the last number of decades, it got stronger and stronger. An offshoot that effectively wasn't settled on equality and wanted to go to better, wanted to say that women were better than men, that men were actually awful and appalling and reprehensible, that we could do without them. I mean, we heard that in the 1990s from some very prominent feminists. And you get the same thing on the edges of the gay rights movements. You get it today. You get it with trans, the absolute obsession with trans figures as a sort of magical, mystical being in our time that you need to get on side in order to prove something else. It's very strange for an age to fixate to the extent that it has on a minority within a minority. And then you get this on the racial issue. And in America, you see it at its absolute worst, where it seems that racial equality isn't what some people are after. They are after revenge, for instance. There is a very strong whiff of revenge in the air, in the American air, and I believe in the air in other countries as well as a result. People who say, for instance, that it's not about equality, what they want to do is end whiteness or shame white people. And these are just such a reprehensible direction to go in, because it's, of course, racism in the name of anti-racism. And it's exceptionally strong in our time. This is not on the fringes. This is in the mainstream media. It comes increasingly from responsible or formerly responsible politicians. And this is the really deep underlying one, is what do you do when you've got to equality? And how would you make sure that you can stay there? That's a real debate. But one of the things it strikes me that we have to be better at in our societies is preventing those people who believe that reaching equality or staying at equality must by necessity involve demonizing another group that they perceive to have had the upper hand in the past.
Do you mind if I ask about that? Because I wonder, I think there'll be people asking some questions about, has equality been achieved in the gay community? Has equality been achieved among women? I mean, I think the issue that would come to mind, of course, is the Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein, who used his position to lord it over women and give parts or withdraw parts on the basis of whether they appease him sexually. I don't know that there are very many examples where women would do that. You may have a few that you want to use. But
there are actually from Hollywood, but yeah.
Yes, and let me do one more. And on the issue, I think we still continue to see excessive use of force, and we continue to have instances where officers are taking down the members of the Black community. And so I think because we don't see equality yet, there still seems to be a fight to be had. How do you respond to that?
Well, several things. I mean, one of the reasons why relations between the sexes have been made so fraught in the public sphere in recent years is because we've based the stampede on the ethics of Hollywood. I mean, it is insane to think of Hollywood as being anything like a good Petri dish from which to understand relations between the sexes. It's the town where the casting couch was invented. Where did it come from, this idea? Who is surprised that there were people in Hollywood using it from all sides in this? So I think there's something very strange in a culture trying to work out its new sexual ethic from the highly unusual terrain of Hollywood. And as I say in The Manners of Crowds, undoubtedly there are men who use their position to get favors and more. Are there cases where that's the same with women? Are there cases where women do the same? Almost certainly. Do they get very much attention? Very much not. It's the same with everything to do with the race debate. There are, I mean, some of your viewers will know this, there are specific problems in American policing. Is it because of institutional racism on the part of the American police? The figures don't back that up. The Washington Post analysis from a few years ago certainly doesn't back that up. There was a man who happened to be white who was killed in exactly the same way as George Floyd was about a year before his death. But there were no worldwide protests because there was no expectant waiting group of people believing that one terrible thing could justify a narrative that claimed that, for instance, our societies are rife with white supremacy and racism and white nationalism and much more, when any reasonable estimation of a society like Canada's or Britain's, or indeed the US's, shows that although such unpleasant people exist, they are far to the margins.
Let me ask just one last question, because we are running out of time. It seems, though, like anyone who has had their character assassinated because of a misstep in one of these areas, there's no path of redemption. There's no way of getting back from the ostracism. So what would your advice be? Now, I think a lot of people would just say, I'm just going to avoid talking about those areas altogether. Is there another way?
There is, and it's one of the things that I suggest people we all think about much more. We have an ethic in our societies now, which is particularly dangerous for young people. Quite often, people say, "Oh, the younger generation are snowflakes," and they're all. I don't like that sort of talk. I don't think it's fair to young people who are growing up in an incredibly dangerous era where a single slip, even in your teenage years, can lead to your life being completely destroyed. So here is my challenge to everyone of what something that we should think about more, which is that if you are going to have an era of correction, you also need to think about how people can come back from it.
Mm-hmm.
So what I describe in The Madness of Crowds in the chapter on forgiveness, we have always as a species, this is something I quote Hannah Arendt saying, we have always as a species had a fear of action because we have had no mechanism for undoing action. The only mechanism for undoing action never does completely undo it, but the nearest thing you can get to undoing it is forgiveness. Mm-hmm. To live in an era in which rampaging blame is everywhere and which doesn't spend any time at all thinking about forgiveness is a society that most of us would not want to engage in, perhaps not even live in. So I strongly recommend to people, even if you want to have the culture wars, even if you want to have the rights debates had in this very ugly way that we're having them at the moment, mm-hmm. how about at least spending a portion of your time thinking about how people come back, thinking about what it means to say sorry, what it means to accurately represent another person's words, listening to other people in a spirit of generosity. That's one that we could do with. Not trying to find the worst possible interpretation of their words and sitting like a sniper hoping to take them out, but listening in a spirit of generosity, trusting that the other person is honestly trying to engage, and so are we. This is all a start to it. Without it, we have a very vengeful cycle, a spiral, in which, among other things, we cannot speak to our fellow citizens. And I hope we can turn that around. I think we can, but we need to think about these things.
Well, maybe this is another conversation for us to return to in 10 years' time to see whether or not you're right in being hopeful. Thank you so much for your time today. We sure appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure.
You got it. That's Douglas Murray. If you want to get his book, I believe that there is a link to it on the website, The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, and Islam. And we've just been talking about the madness of crowds, gender, race, and identity.